We are in the book of Ruth this evening. I'm sure you all saw that. We're going to do all 4 chapters in an hour or less, which means we're going to be flying along. But there's only 85 verses total, so it's not too bad. No, I did not go through and count individually. Who has time for that? But we're in the book of Ruth, and tonight I want to do a book overview. I want to cover some specific themes that we see in this book first, and then we're going to go through the text, because I want to give you some things that you can, that'll pop up later, and you can say, oh, that's what this concept is, or I'm watching this theme progress. The book of Ruth is not only just a beautiful story, but it's got a lot of different levels to it. So the first concept I want to talk about, I'm going to practice my Hebraic pronunciation, chesed. There it is. It's the concept of chesed. And I'm going to write it using letters that we would recognize. And so this is a theme that's found throughout the book of Ruth. This is basically a covenantal loyalty that you would have for somebody else that would go way over and above the call of duty. And so if you might see this in family members who adopt someone that's like, maybe a nephew or a cousin or something like that in the face of tragedy, and they would take that person into their own home and raise that child. They would pay for that child's college. They would take on all the expenses and that sort of thing. That would be something like chesed. We don't have a great word for it, but it's something that when you see somebody do it, you would say, they didn't have to do that, but they obviously wanted to take on this burden. And this concept is mentioned several times in this book. It's also typically the concept of chesed. I just like saying the word, so I'm going to keep saying it. This concept of chesed is also one that in Scripture, 2/3 of the time that it's used, it's referred to God's actions toward us. And so His covenant loyalty, His covenant faithfulness to us, His redemption of us, His going above and beyond, we would say, and loving us. And that's one of the layers that we see in this book is we're starting to look at which characters are acting out what God is doing or acting on His behalf. And so you're going to point to those characters and say, okay, you're acting as God's representative by taking on this action. Does that follow so far? We're going to see what people's roles are in this. So the other thing that I want to touch on, or the other concept that I want to touch on briefly, is the Goel and the Levirate marriage. You all tracking with me on this too? This is another thing. So we got chesed, we've got this covenant loyalty above and beyond, and then we also have this idea of a kinsman redeemer. Have you heard of this, a Goel? The kinsman redeemer. Back in that society, clans were thought, there was a concept of wholeness that influenced the way that people thought of their clans. And a clan would lose its wholeness. There would be a felt piece missing. For example, if there was a financial debt owed to the clan, right? That'd be an obvious reduction of wholeness. That'd be a piece taken away. If there was a murder, and until that murder was, until justice was done, that would be a loss that would interrupt the wholeness. Another way that would happen is if someone died, and there was no one left to carry on the family name or the lineage. Because back at that time in that society, we're going to find this is during the time of Judges that we just taught on, it's in the same time period, you couldn't really sell land that you owned as a family. It was your land. You could lease it. If you were in dire straits, you would, usufruct? You would give somebody else the right to glean from it, but you always had the option to repurchase it for yourself. Does that make sense? If you had it, you could always get, because it's your land, all you can do is sell the rights to it. And so and a couple things, if you lose your land, or if somebody else is using your land, that's a loss of wholeness. But also, if you lose somebody in the family line who would have the inheritance of the land, like you lose the family name and it's erased from history. Which is funny. I was thinking, in our current society, when we tell people, children aren't that important, carrying on the family line. It's more about what you can achieve for you now, and children can really kind of get in the way of what you're seeking to manifest in your life and your self-actualization, And children are good if they can contribute to your life in some way, if they bring you happiness, right? That's why it's kind of like getting a nice handbag, you carry them around, and you get a designer child, that's great. But the idea, but that's really how we think of, not we, all of us, but that is how our society kind of treats children. They're not that important unless they can contribute to your life in some way. And that's pretty I feel like since I've been alive, that's been a way that we've been shifting. But back then, carrying on the family line, once that was lost, it was erased from history. And that was considered a big deal. Because if you think about it, how many billions of people had to get together, to create you specifically? And if you're the end, that all of that is gone now. And so that was the way that they thought about it then. So going back to this idea, so I want to talk about wholeness now. Going back to this idea of kinsman redeemer, this was the nearest adult male blood relative who could try to return the clan to wholeness. And there were some different ways of doing that. So if your clan, this would be the nearest, again, kinsman blood relative who could step into the responsibility of fixing the clan. They didn't have to do it. But it was just like with chesed, you don't have to, but it's the honorable thing. And so here's some ways that you could do that. Like we said, you could redeem or reclaim property that had to be sold at one point because of a person's poverty, so you could redeem that. You could avenge the killing of a clan relative. You could act as the recipient of money paid as restitution for wrong done. So if money was owed to your clan, it could go to you if that person wasn't there anymore. Do y'all follow me so far on some of this stuff? Okay. You could assist a clan relative in a lawsuit so that justice was done. So be an advocate for or make sure that your person got the justice that your kinsman got the justice that they were owed. And then one is you could marry the wife of the deceased, and the children that you would have with the widow would take on the name of her original husband. And so they're carrying on his name now and not your name, which was also considered a great sacrifice, because then your lineage is no longer about you. You're actually stepping in and taking on that role, which again, when your name carrying means a lot of things, means everything. That's an enormous sacrifice. So these are some different ways that the kinsman redeemer could act. So you all tracking with that? So we've got two concepts now, chesed and the goel, which is the kinsman redeemer. And so with that aside, there's a couple other parts of the book I want to talk about, and then we're going to dive in and start reading through it. This is one of those stories that takes place on multiple levels, like any good story, right? You have the specific actions of the characters, but also the deeper themes. So at first, it just seems like a wonderful little love story. That's one level. The second level is that it shows the continuity of God's actions with his people. You'll notice in the Old Testament, God acts in the same way towards his people, and you see the same things happening over and over again. And so this puts it firmly in that narrative. And then you also see that Naomi, by the way, if I were to rename the book, because I have that authority, Lord forgive me, I would actually call it Naomi, because the book is actually not primarily about Ruth, even though she's featured over and over again. The book is actually about Naomi, and you'll see why. She's actually the center of the book, and she's the one through whom God demonstrates his purposes and his character. And so what you see, the other thing that we see in this is this idea of redemption. The book, it says, is only 85 verses long, but it uses the word redemption 23 times in 85 verses. So this is a book about redemption, primarily. And then on the last level, so we talk about levels, the fourth level, this book shows David's lineage. Because we're about to get into, coming up in a few weeks, we're going to really start getting into David, and so this kind of reinforces his lineage. And if we talk about lineage, you all remember, I'm not going to draw the whole. I was going to draw the whole family tree. That would take me 20 minutes, and we don't have time. All right, but I've done it before. All right, y'all remember Abraham, patriarch, right? left his home, went out. He had a nephew named, you all remember his nephew's name? Lot. Abraham and Lot. They went their separate ways. Lot chose the best of things for himself because that's what Lot did. His descendants were the Moabites. So Moab and then the Moabites. And Ruth is a Moabitess. She is in the line of the Moabites, whereas Boaz is in the line of Abraham. Right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and then I sound very impressive because I memorized the whole list, but for the sake of time, we get all the way down to Boaz through that line, through Abraham's line. You all tracking so far? And this will come up again. There's the fact that she is a descendant of Lot and how she approaches Boaz is going to matter thematically when we get to chapter 3, I believe. And then the last thing that's just a bit of trivia for our Bible trivia night is Ruth is read out loud in the synagogue as part of the Feast of Weeks, which is 50 days after Passover, and it's when it's at the end of the grain harvest. That's right, and the giving of the Torah. And so we see that there's a lot of agricultural themes in here, obviously, but there's also the giving of the Torah, the covenant between Yahweh and Israel, because this is a book about covenant, about chesed, about redemption. You all track with me? Themes? We got the themes covered? All right, great. We're going to dive in now. Let's start at the beginning. Let's do verses 1 through 5. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and husband. Kind of a matter-of-fact way to put devastating tragedy. So, and again, they don't have social supports at that time. They're leaving their own ancestral land. We don't know what Elimelech did. We don't know if he sold it for use. We don't know if he just left it to lie fallow, which will come up later. But he left. He took his wife and their 2 sons. They left basically God's land that was there for them, took on wives that were not of their own people, which was kind of a no-no. That was not something that God wanted his people to do. And then all the men died. And so, what's interesting about this, so it's not that marriage to Moabites were necessarily condemned by God, that was Canaanites, but it was true that if you had children by way of a Moabite, they couldn't enter the assembly of the Lord until the 10th generation before they could actually be brought in and considered one of the people. And what's also interesting is the marriages lasted 10 years and there were no children. And we know, and the lack of fertility in this circumstance would have been considered a result of their sins, their unfaithfulness to God. They're doing the wrong thing. And so they don't have descendants. So this family is pretty much guaranteed to have their line wiped out, right? I mean, because if Naomi brings her 2 daughters-in-law back with her to try to marry, to remarry again, well, they're Moabites. They're not, and they're widows. Nobody's going to be lining up to marry these women and have kids with them. They're just not. And she is, she's old. The odds of her finding somebody else again in this culture, because again, when you marry, you're wanting fruitfulness. That's probably not going to happen either. And so they're in a very bad way. And so let's take a look at what happens next. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Now, what do you think's going on with Naomi at this point? What do you think she's thinking or feeling? I mean, where do you think she is in this process? I mean, think about what she's experienced and what she's... What was that? Lost, without direction, without an anchor, really, because she doesn't even, she has property that belongs to her family, but how is she going to get that back? She doesn't have the direction that her husband provided. She doesn't have the future hope of her sons. And she has comfort in her daughters-in-law, which we will see, love her very much. But, she's trying to do the right thing and send them out and give them at least a chance at, what they would consider happiness or they would consider fulfillment. And it's a really dark time. And she also might be thinking, whether or not this is punishment for her for the choices that she made. I mean, they left God's land to go to a different land. They were driven by famine. They married in a way that wasn't according to the law. And so so imagine, you ever been lost and then you pour that guilt on yourself and you're like, how have I, you ever do that, terrible things happen, you start tallying up all the ways that you might have contributed, some more rational than others, right? Some make a lot more sense than others. And so what we have here, though, with this loss is the same thing that we have in our losses. We have, whenever there's a loss or devastation of that type, we have an opportunity for God to step in. And so this is really just kind of setting the stage for the work that God's going to do. So let's continue. She's urging her daughters to go. And verse 9. "The Lord grant that you might find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. That's a pretty powerful text. Would you agree? Now, did Orpah do anything wrong in leaving? No, of course not. I mean, she obviously she's devastated. She even said, "Well, I'll just go with you," and it was on her insistence that she left. She didn't do anything wrong. That was a perfectly fine thing to do. But we talked about the concept of chesed, of way over and beyond the call of duty, way over and beyond expectation. This is where we start to see that chesed with Ruth, just clinging to her mother-in-law and not sending her back alone. And this concept of chesed, I'm losing it, can cost us significantly and put us in some dire situations to take on this level of love and care for somebody. But we'll see that Ruth is not the only person that's showing this covenantal love and care. That there's a lot more going on around this picture and that God has things well in hand. Did you all notice anything else about this text that stood out to you? Yes, Jim.
Sounds like a covenant.
Sounds like a covenant. Yeah.
I think I've heard this before.
Yes. Yeah, it does. It sounds like a covenant. It's a commitment, right? Think of the vows that you would make. That's a covenant. That's a commitment that goes far above and beyond even what's reasonable. And then there's one more thing. Well, we're going to get to it. All right, so let's continue on in verse 19. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Now, you all know this, right? What's Naomi mean? Do you remember? Naomi means pleasant. And Mara means bitter. And by the way, we all know a famous Orpah, right? You all familiar with that? You know that whole story? Oprah's real name is actually Orpah. The Oprah that we know, Oprah Winfrey, but people couldn't pronounce it, so she decided to go with Oprah, and that's that. She's the only Orpah I've ever even heard of. But yeah, oh yeah. I in fact I had to fact check myself before I said that out loud because I was like, is that? But yeah, it's true. All right, so and then look at what she says in verse 21. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. This is going to be a big theme. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, there's a couple things I want to point out. Notice that she says she is empty in her complaint. Her pain and anxiety have completely blurred her perception because it's her pain, my pain, brought me back empty. Meanwhile, there's somebody standing right next to her. Right? Now, have you ever been through that where your own level of pain and personal suffering has kind of taken your general perception and narrowed it completely down to like just this pinhole that you're seeing through, where it's hard to see any of the good in your life around that, and then you become so curved inward and self-focused because of that pain that it's hard to even recognize the blessings that are around you. Is it familiar to anybody? You ever been there? I think we all have. I mean, when our anxiety spikes, when our depression hits, when all of these things, happen to us, when we become overwhelmed, we become completely curved inward, and it ends up being this kind of negative, I guess it would be technically called positive feedback loop that just is self-perpetuating, and that's kind of where she is. She can't see the blessings that are coming in front of her, but the narrator, the author of the text, gives us a hint at those. Because you know what Bethlehem means, where they're going? House of bread. And so she's saying, I'm empty. She was driven out because of a famine, but now she's returning to the house of bread at the beginning of the harvest. And so this is kind of the part of the text where you see a little peek at what's coming. And she can't see it yet, and that's understandable, but that's something that God's going to be bringing to her. Which he does for us, frankly, in pulling us out of those parts where we become so focused on ourselves. So, let's continue on. Chapter 2. How are we doing on time? Time to speed up. All right. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, Go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. So what's going on here? Well, she is going out to glean from fields, which was something that legally Israelites were required to do. You were able to go through your fields once and glean, but you couldn't go back through and get every little piece. You had to leave some left over for foreigners, for widows, orphans, the poor in the field, so that they could go and gain sustenance. And this is how the poor survived. They were able to go, again, behind people through their fields, as long as it wasn't on the first go-round. And every 3 years, there was a tithe taken up that was then given out to the poor so that they could eat. And so those were the two ways that they kind of sustained their poor, or should have. Now we know through Scripture that a lot of times the Israelites didn't allow this to happen, right? I mean, that's the law, but they were like, there's more and it's our field, and so we're just going to do it, and we're not getting zapped by lightning in this exact moment, right? So why not cheat a little bit? And it was actually an uncommon practice to allow people to go, not uncommon, but it wasn't all that common to let people go and glean. You might remember the disciples were doing the same thing in the Gospels when they were picking through the field and they got in trouble with the Pharisees. Why are they doing this on the Sabbath? You all familiar with that? So that's the practice that's happening right now. And then we get to our first bit of, well, actually it's not our first bit of irony. The first bit of irony was saying she's empty when going back to the house of bread. Second bit of irony is brought up when it's, we see, it just so happened, in verse 3, she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Now that's a hyperbolic statement in the Hebrew. It's like, and well, wouldn't you know, surprise, surprise, here's the guy whose field it is, who's who's of the clan of Elimelech, same clan. So again, we're getting these hints throughout things that that the characters have no idea what's going on. So surprise, in verse 4, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, his own people working in the field, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his young men who were in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. What's that say about her character? Hard worker, right? Going out to provide for her mother-in-law all day. That's got to be tough work. And she asked permission to glean in the field. She didn't have to do that, so it's also showing that she's got social graces and humility. Verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go out and glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. So a couple things that I want to point out here. He is magnanimous in this, and here's why. There's something he says. We're going to glean from that, and then we'll get to his magnanimity. So he says to her, don't go out and glean in another field. Don't go away from here. Stay with my girls, so you're not following after them. Now you're actually in the pack gathering as much as you possibly can. I'm going to make sure that nobody touches you, like watch the young men. And whenever you're thirsty, go get a drink from the water jars. And we think, okay, that's generally kind, but we're picking up from this that Ruth was leaving the field as Boaz arrived, that something had been done to her by the male reapers to make her uncomfortable. Now, it could be catcalling, like that's an option. The word is that they won't touch you, so it could have been some more physical form of catcalling. And that it probably happened when she was trying to get a drink of water, that the young men were like, hey, or whatever they said. I'm not very adept at catcalling, but not a ton of practice. I did work in construction, so but don't read too much into that. So some of the things that he did, the provision is just extraordinary. So again, it's not only allowing her to go with them, but in the ancient Near East, it was the foreigners and the women who would draw water for the Israelites and not the other way around. You remember the woman at the well that Jesus meets? And so he's saying, we'll draw water for you, which is, again, this guy is a great guy. And notice he's not just like, hey, you're attractive, so let me put on, this show for you. Because as we'll see in a little bit, plenty of time goes by without Boaz making any intentional sort of move. This is just a reflection on his character. That's all this is. This is saying he's just a good guy. All right, let's continue. Verse 10, then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Now, take note of that. Under whose wings, kanap, you have come to take refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. And at mealtime, verse 14, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, do not reproach her. And also pull out some of the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Second piece of Bible trivia. You ready? What's an ephah? So, I found this interesting just because of how they did measurements. I would never think to do measurements that, we have scales and all these various, automatic processes, but what they used to do is it was measured, you would have a homer, which was the weight that a donkey could carry. You think about some standard of measurement that goes across. A homer is the weight that a donkey could carry, which is 90 kilograms, and a tenth of that was an ephah. And so she was able to get a tenth of that, which would have been enough food for her for a full week to have. And what we'll see is throughout the months that she's there, if she were to gain that much, a week's worth of food every day for the harvest season, she and Naomi would have enough to live on until the next harvest season. You see that deposit there? So again, going above and beyond. And the other thing that we want to point out with his kindness is she's receiving this extraordinary favor and privilege from a landowner who's treating her like a member of the family. And everybody's reading this as like, oh, this is how you treat your family. But she has no idea what the relationship is yet or what the connection is. So there's another bit of irony. You'll see this thing's full of irony. So, all right, let's continue. Verse 18. Then she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Couple things. Do you start to see a shift in Naomi in recognizing the Lord? Do you see that progression there, saying, okay, God is providing? There's like that little bit of hope that's been granted. Another thing that's interesting about this is it's been months. Remember, I just mentioned that. It's been months, and there's no moves made. And so this is also when we're kind of, because this is a process of walking through and discovering God's faithfulness to us. When we've been through that Naomi situation, and we might get a glimpse of something to come, or we might even see that there's hope that we're ready to grasp onto, but we can't. But then it disappears from us right at that moment, or it's not what we were hoping for. It was a shadow of what we were hoping for. If we've experienced a loss and there's an opportunity to gain something back, and we have you ever done that? Have you ever latched on to something? We've been in a difficult situation and latched onto a relationship or a friendship or an opportunity, thinking this is the one, I've got it now. And then nothing manifests for some time, and you start to kind of wonder again, like, Lord, what's going on? And so we get, so it's the end of that, and we think, well, we don't know what's going to happen now. Let's get into chapter 3. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor." Naomi has a plan. Boaz is alone. He's alone at the threshing floor winnowing. You guys know what that is, right? When you took the winnowing fork, you remember this description from the Bible? And you throw what you've gathered up into the air, and all the chaff blows away, and what's solid, what the wheat falls to the ground, or in this case the barley falls to the ground. And so he's apparently out by himself doing this, and Naomi has a plan, right? Because he is our kinsman. You could carry on the family line through Elimelech. Why don't you just go make a proposition, right? Why don't you just go meet? He's by himself, clean up a little bit, and go, and just kind of go feel him out and see what's going on. So, mother-in-law, mothers never have plans like this at all for setting up anybody, I can promise you. Was not my experience. Don't ask me about it, I'm not going to tell you. But anyway, so this happens, right? There's a plot here that's being hatched. There's a little plan that Naomi has. Is not Boaz our relative? So he's, okay, verse 3. Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Good plan, right? Nice and full, got a little wine in his stomach. Anoint yourself, dress, maybe take a bath because you've been in the field all day. So, verse 4, but when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she said, all that you say I will do. Now, time to get into time to turn it into a little bit of a PG explanation of what's going on here. There's some euphemisms going on, uncover your feet, that we wouldn't necessarily be aware of. And it adds tension to the story. And commentators are divided on what actually happens between Ruth and Boaz. So I'm going to give you both perspectives. I'll tell you where I land with it, but I do want to tell you something. There's uncovering his feet and lying down after he's had something to drink, when he's by himself, has sexual connotations. It just does. That that's and when what we see in Scripture, for example, there's some uncover nakedness in this context. It's a euphemism for genitalia. So are feet, by the way. There's in Ezekiel 16:25, for example. There's I believe the Lord speaking to Israel and accuses them of offering your feet to every passerby, which we translate as offering yourself to every passerby. The term for relieving yourself is uncovering your feet. So if somebody's talking, by the way, you can use that in conversation if you've got to go and you interrupt. I've got to go uncover my feet. I'll be back in a few minutes. Don't worry. So people are going to look at you strange. You would be strange, so don't do it. So there's all sorts of references to feet that would mean private parts, or just lower body would be another way to translate that. And so she's asking him to go and uncover his feet. And then you also look at this text, and do you remember how I brought up Lot earlier? Well, you remember the story of Lot. Lot's daughters got themselves pregnant with Lot when they got him drunk so that they would be able to have children. And they went into him when he was, asleep and drunk and slept with him in that circumstance. And so you have to think about that connection that she's a descendant of Lot. And she's going in when this man's been drinking, and has her own plans going on. You all follow me on that? So that's kind of the background. When you're reading this, you're like, that's the mother-in-law's plan? These are supposed to, they're virtuous people. And so, so it's difficult. It's really difficult to get away from those, from reading that into the text. And then the other thing that we have to think about with Ruth doing this is that's an enormous risk. Think about the risk that she's taking. Right now, she's got a good situation, right? Like at least they're able to eat and live. That's better than nothing, and not have to worry when it's not harvest season anymore. But what if she goes in there, and because she is a widow, which again was a big deal then, and she's a Moabite, that's a big deal. What if she's rejected? Then what? Does she not get to glean in the fields anymore? And so Naomi is actually showing a measure of faith that maybe something's at work, behind the scenes here. So, you have any thoughts about that? Yes.
Well, she says to her, observe the place where he lies. My research shows that he wasn't alone, that his servants and people who gleaned, who were bringing in the harvest were there. And the reason she told her to look to make sure you know where he lies, so you didn't go to the wrong guy.
That's not what my commentary said, but I like that better because that's funny to me. So that's not what I read, but fair enough. Yeah, that could be awkward. And then another situation, right? We've already had 2 mentions of her vulnerability.
But she's also a very virtuous woman.
She is. Then I'm not. Yeah, I'm not. So I'll get there. I'll get there. But another thing is we've already seen how vulnerable she is, right? She was vulnerable to the men in Boaz's own field. She would be vulnerable to be assaulted in any other field. Naomi already said that. And now she could very easily be sexually assaulted and nothing shown of it, right? That's a real possibility. And so, anyway, so there's a lot of tension built into this. If you've already read it, you know what's going to happen. But there's tension as you're going through the story. All right, so verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she... you have full stomach and a lot of wine, you're always going to have a merry heart. All right. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. That'd be a surprise, right? He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." That's quite a request. You know what she's calling him to do, right? 1, kanat, the spreading of your wings. You remember when Boaz blessed her and said, "May the Lord cover you with his wings"? She's taking that blessing that he offered her, that he said, "May the Lord go do this," and she's calling him on it. You said, "May the Lord bless me. You're my kinsman redeemer. You be the blessing. You cover me with that garment. You enact that blessing that the Lord would give me in this covering of the wings," is what she's calling on him to do. She's asking, that's a marriage proposal, is what it is. And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter." So he recognizes it. "You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in which you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until morning. So, despite all the sexual tension, where do I land on what actually happened here? A couple of things. She uncovered the garment, but he never woke up. So I'm doubting that there was some, got to be careful with language, vigorous activity happening. That probably wasn't any better than anything else I could have chosen. That's probably the worst thing. Anyway, so doubtful anything happened, and she's also shown to be a virtuous woman here. He even says that you are a virtuous woman. We already know Boaz is a virtuous man. And so in all likelihood, the intended sexual implications of this are about marriage. It's about them being, it's foreshadowing their marriage together, which, is that sort of union. So that's where I think I had 4 commentaries that said probably didn't do anything, one that said they did. So on that's where I kind of land on the maybe didn't do something. And then what's he say? He says, well, I'll do it. I'll marry you. I will take on the role of kinsman redeemer, which again, we talked about what a big deal that is. That's no small sacrifice. But he is such a virtuous man that he says, instead of just saying, there's actually, to be honest, somebody closer who has the right to marry you before I do. And because he wants to do things so by the book, instead of just marrying her, he's willing to set that desire aside. I mean, obviously he's attracted to her because he's like, this is a blessing to me. You're young, clearly he's not. She's obviously attracted by the way that she gets approached by others. So it's like, this is a huge blessing and honor to me, but I want to do things the right way. And so what happens is, again, we have another moment of suspense. Like in a good movie where it's, things are going to resolve, something happened, then, things are going to resolve, and then, you're like, you do it too many times and you lose me. But this is a twist because we celebrate the fact that she's accepted and he says yes, and then we don't know if that's going to happen or not. We don't know who it's going to be. So let's continue on because we have... All right, verse 14. So she lay at his feet until morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. She replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. You ready for the next one? Final chapter. All right, let's get after it. Boaz confronts the unnamed kinsman. Now, Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And by the way, just the gate, they did some archaeological evidence of gates, and they found that there were benches that were lined up, you might know this already, lined up by gates, and that's where official proceedings were held. And to get, it's basically where court was held, was at the city gates. And so you would get elders of the town, and they would sit down if you wanted an official judgment, and you would enter, you would do business in front of this council, and then it was officially ratified. So Boaz, again, following the right steps. He's not just going to the person. He wants to make sure everything is done according to the letter. So, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here, and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. So again, who does the land belong to? It belongs to Elimelech, right? And by extension, Naomi can't technically own the land because she's a woman, but she has, she's able to, be made whole by the kinsman redeemer buying it for her clan, and she would profit of that. But so again, what's probably happening is somebody else is tilling it, and they're saying, well, now that you have the right to buy that land back, so pay out the lease basically, and you can own the land. And this unnamed kinsman redeemer, which he's unnamed for a reason, which we'll get to, who, by the way, has known that Naomi has been there. It's been his responsibility to help her. And have we heard of him before? Has he done anything for Naomi or Ruth, or stepped in any role at all? No, he hasn't. He hasn't done a darn thing. But now that he realizes, I can buy this land, and I can have my sons inherit this land. It just becomes part of my family name and inheritance now. Elimelech's line is gone. It's mine now because I have that right and pass it on. Sure, I'll buy the land and increase, my ancestral, property, my ancestral land. So he says, sure, I'll do it. Now Boaz leaves something out, doesn't he? Verse 5, then Boaz says, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, it's like, by the way, here's the fine print, here's a little small thing. You also acquire Ruth the Moabite. It's like, kind of a bit, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Whoops, won't be yours. You can buy it and spend money on this, but it's not going to be wrapped up into the inheritance of your line. It's going to stay in his name. And that's who it's going to belong to. And what's the Redeemer do? He says, I can't do that. The Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. He wants no part in it. It's going to cost him something. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. Another practice we can bring back, by the way, other than saying I'm going to go uncover my feet, maybe we just make deals with shoe trades. So, it could be. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. And who is in the line of David? Jesus. Isn't that an amazing story? And see, do you see, this is what I mean about it being, it's a story that goes from death and emptiness, right? Naomi says, I am empty. And at the end, what we have is new life in the child, and we have fullness. Naomi's heart is full. Her prospects are full. The clan has been restored and brought to wholeness. And everybody had a part to play by their integrity, and the part that Ruth played is she embodied the ethic of, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, of giving everything that she had for her mother-in-law when she didn't have. She embodied chesed. Boaz embodied chesed by making tremendous personal sacrifice in order to redeem the land, in order to carry on the line of Elimelech, in order to cover, which again, kanap, which is the covering of the wings, which God describes himself of doing that, right, of being a covering for Israel and caring for them, covering them with his garment. And if nothing else, it shows that God, and we see this all the time in the Old Testament, but that we have our plans and we have our world, but God has all these larger things that he's orchestrating and putting into place. And so there's a greater narrative that we're a part of, and we can't always see, what our role is in that. We have trouble seeing past our own despair or difficulty sometimes to see how God's hand is shaping things. Do you have any other thoughts about this text in Ruth, or any themes that you want to pick up on? It's just, because Boaz and Ruth, did they go above and beyond the call of duty? Yes. But were they superhuman? No, they just lived with integrity. They lived virtuous lives, and because of them, they really shaped the lineage out of which we get David, out of which we get Jesus, which is really something else. So, all right. Well, if you don't have anything. Fathers, any thoughts before we wrap up? Okay. All right, well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word, for the fact that you have given us your word as an anchor that expresses the truth of how you treat us, your relationship with us, how much you care for us, and the fact that we can trust in your redemption, that we can trust in the redeeming of your Son, who has bought us back from the pit. And so, Lord, we thank you that you have all things in your hands, that you are shaping the course of history to its proper end. God, I pray that we would lift our eyes to you and we would experience the fullness that can come from walking in your presence and the fulfillment of your plan, even as we might experience our own temporary emptiness. In your Son, Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.